What is smart mobility, and how does it apply to you? We're steering Greater Victoria toward a smart mobility future with a focus on
I appreciate all of you being here. We're waiting for a few more members to come as they complete the last votes as I speak. And then I'll have a little bit to say. As I will explain when members get here, I have an amendment on the floor. So my staff will let me know when I have to leave. Of course, I'll come back. But we will wait. The members will be sitting over there. Well, my good friend, the ranking member, has come from where I've come, so we all understand that. And we're about to have a joint reception of Republicans and Democrats because this committee works together. This is the kind of thing we do together. I just want to start off. Roundtable is done a little differently. I'm going to ask the ranking member after I speak, of course. But in a roundtable, as the members are able to come back, anybody can jump in. We're going to hear, of course, from you first. We're also going to get a video. Maybe we should start with that. Are we able to start with that even before I speak?
That's up to you.
Let's start with the video. If it's going to be delayed, I'm going to speak. Okay.
What is smart mobility, and how does it apply to you? We're steering Greater Victoria toward a smart mobility future with a focus on two major areas: a multimodal transportation system and an integrated planning and payment system. Now, let us explain to you what that is and how it fits into smart mobility to benefit you. Think about the future. Does it involve autonomous vehicles, electric buses and cars, ride sharing, magnetic levitation trains, push bikes, e-bikes, scooters, hoverboards, even tunnel tube transportation systems? These are all current ideas in development or pilot phases across the world, and they're closer to reality than ever before. This will change how we use our time, how we enjoy our commute, how we spend our money, and even how we manage and build our cities. Public transit is just one of the many options in the overall mobility landscape. But wait, smart mobility is much more than just cool new ways of getting around. Wouldn't it be nice to have a single tool or one method for booking, planning, and paying for your mobility all in one easy-to-use app? And there's no hassle like needing to carry exact change for the bus. New technologies can connect all of these modes and services through integrated trip planning and payment, either by app or through a single payment card, one source to cover it all. And if getting around becomes more flexible, predictable, personalized, and easy, fewer people may need to own cars or at least use their vehicles less. So think about it. What does this mean for you? First and foremost, it means accessibility to a multimodal system and an integrated payment system to tie it all together in one place for your convenience. But there are many more benefits, like saving you travel and commuter time, and more importantly, money. Less cars equals less congestion, which is better for the environment. More efficient, flexible, predictable, and personalized transportation options. Better health and well-being by encouraging more active means of commuting, bikes, scooters, walking. And improvements in data collection also facilitates improved learning and positive changes to the region, and that leads to better land use planning. The South Island process.
Okay. I've been wanting to have this roundtable. I only regret that we have so many hearings that we had to push this into the afternoon when we were bound to get fewer members. But that doesn't indicate the interest in the Congress, and I can tell you in this subcommittee chair, in MOD. That's a new word for us. When we passed the bill, the bipartisan bill we passed not even 4 years ago, those words didn't even exist. Mobility on demand. That shows you how Congress has to catch up. And so what we want to do today is to determine just what Congress should do, because mobility on demand is out there. Now, if you go into my district, and members do, of course, you will see mobility on demand everywhere you go. Indeed, what makes me want to hold this roundtable is not only its time, but I want to ride a scooter. And I must say that we're having trouble getting a place. We're trying to get a place where these MODs can gather, especially the scooters, so that people can see how they operate and even ride them. I'm having trouble with the Capitol Police because I wanted to have it right out in front of the Capitol. I'll find a place. This is, after all, my district. But this isn't, scooters may be most intriguing because you see them everywhere, but you also see everywhere lots of MODs. You see car share and bike share. You see micro transit. as we call it, where you can go short distances and tool up with public transit. In other words, in 4 years, this has been a revolution in how to get around. What's most important about this is that it's relieving congestion, and otherwise, I can say to you, I don't see any way to relieve congestion. The first and public mile to public transit is particularly intriguing. So it won't take you the whole way. The scooter won't take you the whole way. Micro transit won't take you a whole way. But look at the way that's relieving and enhancing public transit to have these other modes of transit on the roads. Above all, it means fewer drivers. There would have been no other way to get drivers like me on the streets. Remember, I'm getting on one of those scooters without this kind of MOD. So what we're trying to do is to ask our witnesses to help us to determine how to sort this out, how to make an even playing field for providers of MODs who are having such an impact even before Congress has gotten there. I hope you can help us define Congress's role better without shutting anything off, letting 1,000 flowers bloom. I'm going to ask my good friend, the ranking member, Mr. Davis, to say a few words.
I do want to thank Chairwoman Norton and also our panel. Excuse me. Saw my good friend Greg over there and he choked me up. Apologize, Greg. Hey, this roundtable is a free-flowing discussion that I like this format. We get a chance to ask questions back and forth. You get a chance to, in a lot less formal setting, talk to us about what you think the MOD movement's all about, and tell us about what you think the future's going to look like. It's pretty telling. I agree with the chair when she said just a few years ago, who would have ever known that I'd have the chance to see my good friends Jeff Denham and David Valadeo zooming down the street on a scooter in the San Diego area last year when we were on a border tour. It was scary enough seeing those big guys on a scooter, let alone asking me to join them. And my answer, of course, was no. But this technology is here. This is what we need to look to when it comes to policies at putting good regulations in place that don't stop the investment in technology that we see on the streets today, but we also want to make sure they're safe technologies. This is no different than a few years ago when UAE came onto the marketplace. And how do we establish provisions that allow the technology to continue to grow, but at the same time, don't have bureaucracy stopping that growth and stopping the new innovation? So we're here today to hear from you. I'm excited about it. I certainly hope that, we've got Ms. Miller and Mr. LaMalfa here. I know they want to hear from you. I just hope you're going to shed some light on some of the policy initiatives that you think are going to work. That's the key. That's what we need to know as we move into the reauthorization process of the FAST Act. I look forward to working with you all, and I look forward to hearing from each of you today. And I certainly hope that Greg doesn't choke me up again. With that, Madam Chair, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Davis. So we're going to start right out, asking each of our witnesses to speak 5 minutes. Unfortunately, the monitor is behind you, but staff is keeping track. You can reasonably figure what 5 minutes. Why don't we start with you, Scott Bogren, Executive Director, Community Transportation Association of America. Push it on, yeah.
Thank you, Chairwoman Holmes Norton and Ranking Member Davis, other committee members here. I'm Scott Bogan. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Transportation Association of America. It's a national nonprofit association of about 1,500 rural, small city, tribal, specialized services serving older adults and people with disabilities and non-emergency medical transportation providers and advocates. And it's really great to be a part of this important discussion. The process of making a collection of transportation and mobility services respond to an individual's trip needs using emerging and existing technologies is really the central truth of mobility on demand. And it really fundamentally changes the traditional transit dynamic from asking the customer to fit their trip to an existing system or provider, and instead asks how the existing transit mobility service can best meet the needs of an individual and a passenger. CTA members have long understood this, having done pioneering work in accessible transportation with the ADA, services for older adults, veterans, in tribal communities, and in meeting the non-emergency healthcare needs of patients. Rural and specialized transit systems virtually invented the notion of demand response transportation about 30 years ago. And when those systems were invented, there was always a notion of like a 24 or a 48-hour advance notice kind of window to get those trips. And today, on demand means on demand. And really, we're asking and working with a lot of our members to kind of leave behind that notion of the window of 24 and 48 hours. For smaller transit operators, the successes we're seeing in adapting on-demand mobility is built around outcomes with specific purposes in mind that can be measured and evaluated. Specifically, these examples tend to address increasing mobility options and reducing isolation, which oftentimes leads to increases in ridership, driving down the cost of healthcare, achieving better results in human service delivery, and enhancing community and public transportation efficiency. In Vermont, one of our members, the state's Agency on Transportation, is currently using an FTA MOD sandbox grant to develop an interoperable open source data feed using, get in the weeds here a little bit, GTFS Flex, which really allows the state to, for the first time, take demand response operations and weave them together with traditional fixed route in a trip planning mode. And what it gets rid of is when somebody in rural Vermont wants to use a Google trip planner, something saying because there's no fixed route bus, there's no transit available, when in fact there is transit available. So far, in about 2 months of use, 1,500 unique users are now using that service in Vermont, and we know we're going to see a lot of additional usage. In Flint, Michigan, one of our members has a system called Rides to Wellness, which is a mobility on demand service. It's provided 10,000 trips last month in sedans. That system, which was the winner of our Urban Transit System of the Year, has developed 15 partner agencies and is helping local healthcare systems reduce no-shows and with late night discharge. And these are some of the trip demands that I think can be met with good, effective mobility on demand. Plans are underway currently in Flint to expand the service to veterans in Genesee County and also to neighboring Shiawassee and Lapeer counties. In central Oklahoma, specifically Oklahoma County, the Arnall Family Foundation and state human service leaders knew they needed to address the mobility challenges in increasing successful reunifications of biological parents with children placed in the state's foster care system. CTAA has partnered with the fixed route operator in Oklahoma City, Embark, and the Oklahoma Transit Association to win the grant. And we are currently in the process of developing on-demand mobility using technology and a network to help reunify biological parents with their children in foster care. These are just some of the examples of the innovative work underway around the country that's turning mobility on demand from a promising concept into a reality. It's essential that the FAST Act's successor provide the continued federal investment and even incentives to continue the progress we're seeing across the country in mobility on demand.
Thank you, Mr. Brogan.
Thank you.
Please wind up. I want to go next to Faye Dasky, Senior Policy Analyst of the District of Columbia Department of Transportation. 5 minutes.
Good afternoon.
Into your microphone, please.
Good afternoon, the Honorable Chair and members of the committee. My name is Faye Daskey with the District Department of Transportation, Office of Policy and Legislative Affairs. I'm delighted to be here to answer any questions regarding mobility on demand or MOD services in the district. The transportation sector has seen rapid transformation over the last decade with no signs of slowing down. This has fundamentally changed the role of DDOT as we work to both welcome this innovation and to ensure that it meets our goals to reduce single-occupant vehicles, increase transit mode share, and ensure public transit remains the backbone of our transportation system. The district was one of the first markets for for-hire vehicles in 2010. With the goal of reducing pedestrian vehicle conflicts along high-demand corridors, we implemented one of the first pickup drop-off zones for for-hire vehicles in 2017. The district has also been an early adopter of scooters. As a part of our goal to reduce single-occupancy vehicle rides in the city, DDOT set up a pilot program for dockless bicycles and scooters in the fall of 2017. During the demonstration period, we had frequent roundtable discussions with companies regarding data sharing, safety, equity, and the usage of these devices in public space. The overwhelming use of these mobility options inspired the official permit program in 2019. We view mobility on demand as a valuable toolbox from which to address our city's unique travel needs. Our approach to date has been to first pilot emerging mobility solutions, such as dockless vehicles, as a means to better understand their value and requirements for integration. Through working with private providers, analyzing data, and receiving public feedback, we have refined the way we approach new mobility options in the district. We have learned that preparing for the future of transportation in the district requires us to remain agile as emerging technologies become available. We continue to remain focused on what these services can add to the district and how they can be optimized to benefit our residents regardless of where they live in the city. Thank you for your time, and I'm pleased to answer any questions regarding the fast-evolving ecosystem of mobility on demand.
Thank you very much. Going on now to Michael Hayes, Director of Government Affairs, Consumer Technology Association.
Thank you, Subcommittee Chair Holmes Norton. I'm a constituent of yours in Ward 5, so thank you for having me here today, and Ranking Member Davis for inviting me to this important discussion. I'm Michael Hayes, Director of Government Affairs for the Consumer Technology Association, CTA. We're the trade association representing the $351 billion U.S. consumer technology industry, which supports more than 15 million U.S. jobs. CTA member companies like Uber, Lyft, Daimler, Bird, and Lime are revolutionizing the way that Americans travel. Never before have people had so many transportation options at their fingertips. A commuter from a suburb, for example, can choose to take a shared ride to public transit rather than having to pay for expensive parking downtown. Dockless scooters and e-bikes make local restaurants or shops immediately accessible to surrounding neighborhoods. At their core, these new technologies have one thing in common: consumer choice. No single mode of transportation is going to solve all of the needs of all Americans. Diverse trips demand diverse solutions. This is where technology thrives, giving consumers the ability to fill gaps and inefficiencies in their daily transportation needs. I'd like to give you a quick overview of how people are using some of the technologies that our member companies create. First, ride sharing. Globally, over 1 million rides each day are provided by Uber and Lyft, millions of rides, in fact. Riders can choose whether they want to save money and share a ride or whether they want a private car. At least 1/3 of Americans use rideshare services, and depending on the platform, 20 to 35% of those rides are shared rides. Lyft alone is available to 95% of the U.S. population. Rideshare services have had a particularly significant impact on low-income and underserved communities, communities that don't have convenient access to public transit and aren't adequately served by taxis. Take, for example, that 44% of Lyft rides start or end in low-income areas, and a recent UCLA study found that together Uber and Lyft serve 99.8% of the city of Los Angeles. These services have democratized access to transportation. Sharing a ride is not the only way to share a vehicle. Sometimes a person who does not own a car may need a vehicle to run a series of errands or maybe make a longer trip. And Daimler-owned Car2Go makes on-demand rental cars easily available in neighborhoods across the country. Some of the most exciting mobility solutions are happening in e-scooters, e-bikes, micro-mobility solutions. At first glance, these can look like just a fun way for people to take a quick ride. They are indisputably fun. And shared pogo sticks, which actually are real, surprisingly, fall probably into the fun camp. But e-scooters, e-bikes, they represent real serious transportation solutions for people. In Washington, D.C., for example, 1/3 of jump bike rides began or ended in neighborhoods with the lowest frequency of other transit options. And a recent report by the Portland Department of Transportation found that 71% of riders used scooters to get from a specific point to another specific point. People of color, 74%, and people with incomes under $30,000, 66%, viewed the availability of scooters in Portland the most favorably of any groups. So what's the future of mobility on demand? New mobility solutions have already provided communities with unprecedented access to affordable transportation, facilitated more efficient commutes, and given consumers the opportunity to choose more environmentally conscious means of transportation. Further innovations and better integration with existing transit systems will continue to improve that experience for millions of Americans. Uber and Lyft have already incorporated transit planning into their app in many cities, and a user can quickly see whether it makes most sense, both financially and in terms of trip time, to take public transit or one of the other mobility solutions I've discussed. In other cases, they have specific partnerships to provide last-mile solutions, and in other cases, companies like Movil, a Daimler-owned company, have partnered with Portland TriMet and other transit agencies to create the first of their kind virtual fare cards for public transit. Some platforms are working on fully integrated trip planning like we saw in the video here, where a customer will be able to use real-time data to make the most efficient multimodal trip. For example, the fastest way to get to work might be taking a dockless scooter 1 mile to a bus station and then riding a couple of stops to your office. In the not-too-distant future, you could see the exact time and cost of that in an app and book it with one click. There's a strong reason to believe that collaboration between transit agencies and new mobility technologies is only beginning. Consumer demand will drive many of these partnerships, but there are also ways this committee can help. One such opportunity would be to modernize how rideshare trips and other new mobility trips are incorporated into national transit database reporting from and to transit hubs. Thank you for hosting this important discussion on new mobility technologies. I look forward to working together to make sure that consumers continue to have access to the most convenient and efficient transportation innovations.
Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I will remind members that a roundtable is a free-for-all. So after these witnesses testify, it's all in whenever you please. I'd like to ask Tim McHugh, the Chief Financial Officer of the Tri-County Metropolitan Transportation District of Oregon, to speak at this point, TriMet. Mr. McHugh, 5 minutes.
I actually have a presentation. Good afternoon. My name is Tim McHugh. I'm the Chief Information Officer for TriMet, which is the Mass Transit District in Portland,
Speak into
Oregon.
that microphone.
I'm sorry. So I'm here. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what the advances we have been making in mobility on demand. Next. So at TriMet, we recognize that while mass transit is the backbone of the transportation in the region, there is all of these things that we've been talking about exploding around us. And that we need to make sure that we don't let this become chaotic, that it become a chaotic Wild West of transportation with the potential to have negative impacts on congestion and an equity divide. So the first step that we took in this is to take a look at how we can bring together all of the modes that are available from a consumer's perspective and make them visible to them. Next. Back in 2009, TriMet convened a group to create what's known as the Open Trip Planner. It's an open source software application that is used to combine transit, biking, and walking. Next. That is now deployed in dozens of countries, both cities and countries worldwide, proving that it is actually very effective and tool that it can be replicated in anywhere in the world. Next. With the FTA's Mod Sandbox grant that came out a couple years ago, we looked at what we could do for that to advance OTP to the next phase. So what we did was we looked at all of the different shared use modes and how could we take all of those and put them into a single mode, a single trip with all modes considered as a part of that mode. So a really truly intermodal trip. Next. Our solution, as I said, pulls in all of the different modes. You can see visually there, currently it supports bike share, car share, and biking alone. Next. The strategy we took with this is important. As I said, it's an open source software project, and what we wanted to do is then extend that into open data and open standards to make it so that it's truly possible to do a implementation anywhere in the world. Next. While trip planning is an important part of the mobility as a service or mobility on demand or mobility management or whatever term is thrown out there, depending on who you're talking to, it is just one component of an overall platform. Next. Integrated payment is another big piece of that. Integrated payment means that we can pass the funds from one party to another. That's a really complicated endeavor. That is something that I think many people are looking into, and it is a big project. Next. There's lots of features in the new beta trip planner. It was released in March. It is now not only a desktop application, which it was previously, it is now completely mobile, and it provides trip planning for all of the modes that I mentioned before. Next. It also combines real-time information. If you look at this slide, you can see that there's up in the red portion of it there, that's the Portland Airport, trying to take a trip to the St. John's area, which is a suburb in Portland. That's a very long trip, and this is at night. If I were presented with this, I wouldn't take it home. It's just simply too long. Next. If you combine that with Uber, though, you can see that it provides a much more practical option, and that you could take an Uber for the first leg of the trip, hook you right into the transit trip, and get you home, and it's at an affordable cost. From this application, when you execute that trip, you can click on the first leg, and it will take you directly into the Uber app, so that it passes your origin and destination information to the app, so that it brings you into the app next, directly and ready for you to execute the trip. That's really important because fumbling around between all of the apps and all the different providers is a barrier. You really can't just conceptually think of all the options that you have right now, have all of those apps open on your phone, and go around. You're not going to do that. You're just going to choose one and move on. Next. There's lots of other cool features. We talked about bikes, dockless and docked. This will show you the locations of the bikes, the docks, the amount of bikes that are available, slots that are available to park your bike, and it's all real-time information. Next. As an example of the replicability, like I said, we just released this in March to the public for the first time, and MARTA already has a test instance of this up and running. So in just a couple of months, another agency was able to take this and get it up and running.
You're coming up on 5 minutes.
The approach is important. You heard me say open data, open architecture, open this, open that. I know those are a lot of technical terms. Open APIs is a technical term, but this is critical in order to put together the infrastructure required to provide what you see in the lower right-hand corner, rather than a bazillion apps, being able to open up the marketplace and combine services in a coherent fashion to the public. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. McHugh. Next, Brad Miller, Chief Executive Officer, Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority.
Thank you, Chair Norton, Ranking Member Davis, and the rest of the committee. I'm really honored to be here. As the CEO of the Pinellas Suncoast Transit Authority in beautiful St. Petersburg, Florida, it's a real honor for me to be here and present to your committee how PSTA, my agency, is transforming itself from a traditional role as a public transit system providing bus services to becoming a true mobility manager for our community. PSTA has been honored to be leading the public transportation world toward this new mobility paradigm. We started down this path back in 2016, when we were the very first public transit agency in the world to partner with a transportation network company, Uber. At the time, public transit was viewing the TNCs as the enemy that was threatening the industry, and we were able to change that perspective with our launch of our very first program, our first mile, last mile partnership with Uber and taxi companies to take advantage of the new technology and to provide connections from neighborhoods and businesses that weren't directly on our bus lines so that they could connect to the transit network. Beyond demonstrating how TNCs could help public transit access more customers, that first partnership was even more valuable in establishing a great relationship between Uber and PSTA. Soon after, we launched our second and most successful partnership entitled our TD Late Shift program. Again, with the help of Uber and taxi services, low-income workers in our community can now access third shift jobs where they can use the bus to get to the job, but with the job shifts ending after the buses stop running late at night, they can get a free Uber or taxi ride home. More important than the transit rides this program has enabled, this program has changed people's lives, giving them jobs that they could not have otherwise accessed previously. Our latest partnership is also improving the quality of life in our community, this time for people with disabilities. Thanks to fantastic support from FTA's Mobility on Demand Sandbox program, now paratransit customers can access a Lyft ride, taxi, or accessible vehicle ride in 10 minutes or real time, rather than making a reservation 24 hours in advance. We've gone from providing almost exclusively trips to and from scheduled medical appointments to a system that takes citizens to the movies or to go see their grandchildren. Besides improving the mobility of our Florida community, all three of these programs, with more on the way I'm certain, have something else in common. Each of these programs increases access and the value of our existing traditional public transit system. With 5 million tourists sinking their toes into the sandy white beaches during spring break, our ever-increasing traffic congestion on the many Tampa Bay bridges, or even to support the more than 200,000 citizens that came to St. Petersburg for this past Saturday's St. Pete Pride Parade, the largest celebration of its kind in the Southeast, we're always going to need to invest in a high-capacity public transit system. We will need the federal government to continue to support transit investment for bus and bus facilities, for capital investment grants for our bus rapid transit projects. But no doubt the transportation world is changing. We're never going to be the bus system that we once were. We're always going to have these partnerships with Uber and Lyft, scooters, bike share, and transportation providers. They're a permanent part of what our transit authority does now. With the continued support of the federal government, we can keep improving the mobility and quality of life in Pinellas County, Florida. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. Finally, Greg Regan, Secretary Treasurer, Transportation Trades Department, AFL-CIO.
Thank you,
5
Chairwoman.
minutes, Mr. Regan.
Thank you, Chairwoman Norton, Ranking Member Davis. I'm happy to be here on behalf of TTD and our 33 affiliated unions. The discussion today is about public transportation policy and the potential role that mobility on-demand operators can or should play in the future delivery of these services. At TTD, we believe public transportation is and always has been a promise made by the government to the American people, a promise that we can all depend on public transit to connect us to work, to school, to doctor's appointments, and to our families. A promise that these services provided will be safe, affordable, accessible to all, and reliable. And a promise that those who work in this sector earn fair, livable wages. When considering any policy proposal or new service provider, I will judge them on whether they help fulfill this promise. I'm not here to simply advocate for the status quo, however. TTD supports innovative improvements to our transportation landscape that give more people better access to these services. Labor unions are proud advocates for innovative policies and technologies that aid transit operators and enhance safety. And we support workforce training and development programs that prepare our members for 21st century transportation jobs. We welcome the opportunity to work with any partner who is advocating for better and more public transportation services. We also recognize the opportunity that mobility on-demand services may offer, but we expect partners in innovation to subscribe to the promise of public transportation as I earlier described it. Sadly, the business model being pursued by ride-sharing companies like Uber and Lyft runs counter to the benefits public transportation provides to communities across this country. These companies gouge their workers, set their own safety standards, and are not always accessible by those who rely on transit the most, and that's by design. By taking advantage of the current regulatory framework, these companies seek to line the pockets of investors at the expense of communities in which they operate. Consider these facts. The mean wage for urban transit drivers is $20 an hour. In some cities, wages are as high as $40 an hour, and these jobs generally come with good benefits and retirement packages that come with a strong union contract. By contrast, Uber and Lyft lure drivers with the promise of high earnings, but slash the driver's share of revenue to the bone as recently as 2015. Now these companies are coming for public money because they need a pathway to profitability that simply is not there right now. A recent study found that Uber drivers earn the equivalent of roughly $9 an hour in hourly wages with no benefits. That is less than what 90% of American workers earn and below the mandatory minimum wage in the majority of Uber's urban marketplaces. As a result, many rideshare drivers are forced to hold 2 or 3 additional jobs, often for working for more than one rideshare company just to make ends meet. The kind of economic insecurity leads to tired, overworked drivers on our roads, which is a significant safety risk, and contributes to the wealth gap we see in our country today. While traditional public transportation is subject to a wide array of regulatory, labor, and safety requirements, companies like Uber and Lyft skate by under a patchwork of local and state regulations that allow these companies to evade requirements like accessibility, vehicular safety, and data sharing. For example, there is no universal standard for ride-sharing drug testing or background tests or checks. Not every state requires non-discrimination policies, and even fewer require companies like Uber and Lyft to provide wheelchair-accessible vehicles for their customers. Rideshare companies are notorious for fighting state and local data sharing requirements at every turn, and efforts to afford these drivers the right to collectively bargain has been aggressively opposed by these companies at all levels of government. Despite their anti-worker, minimal safety, and selective accessibility business models, we have seen a rush by transit agencies to form partnerships with Uber and Lyft. In fact, since 2016, more than 30 of these partnerships have been formed. While we understand why these transit agencies are partnering with rideshare companies, we're asking you, policymakers, to consider the broader impact they're having on our communities. At the current rate, companies like Uber and Lyft stand to cause a 13% decline in bus ridership over the next 8 years. Already, these companies have added 5.7 billion miles of new vehicle traffic in 9 of our largest cities, with another 5.5 billion miles expected each subsequent year. And because most of these rides are single occupancy, they are moving many riders out of the shared spaces such as buses and trains and into cars, further contributing to the congestion and environmental problems that public transportation is in part meant to solve. If companies like Uber and Lyft are ever to receive federal incentives, Congress must take the lead in providing thoughtful and real oversight to the rideshare industry. After all, it is not the duty of our nation's transit agencies to prop up failing private businesses. While the opportunities presented by new technology are exciting, we must consider whether this technology is actually advancing the goals that policymakers aim to achieve. Goals like the creation of living wages, increased safety, reduced congestion, improved accessibility, and the creation of environmentally sustainable transit options. Companies who peddle software that accomplishes none of these should not be rewarded for bad behavior or applauded for undermining our existing system. And with that, I thank the committee for once again inviting me, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Regan. You just introduced one of the complications that I don't think we're thinking about, excited about it. But you know, it needs a workforce to do anything. And that's something that indicates why this roundtable is so necessary. I just want to indicate that when we hear all these options and they sound so extraordinary, for example, Mr. McHugh, who illustrated his, I tend to think that just as you decide with the options you have, of course we have only, let's say, a couple or 3, which options are best for you to get from X to Z, like from home to work, people will figure it out. And they really won't need all of these. It's just that they are available in case you do. So I'd just like to start out, and remember this is a free-for-all, so anybody can speak up. I have been a big supporter of scooters and bikes, and all without thinking about public safety issues. So I want to put on the table a very troublesome issue. I mean, in my own district, you begin to see what we should have expected. People, after all, for a long time, we see people on bikes being killed. We see more of that in my own district. The same is beginning to occur for scooters, and we don't even have the regulations in place nationwide to deal with these new forms of transportation. Have any of you begun to think through the safety issues so that you can inform the regulators who themselves are only beginning to think through how to both encourage these new forms and to make sure you don't discourage it with regulations that keep the new forms from getting on the road? Who wants to speak up?
You know, please, go ahead.
Go ahead.
You know, you have the most insight on DC streets here. I'm happy to weigh in after you.
If I may.
Speak into the microphone.
If I may. So when it comes to mobility on demand services, specifically scooters, there are two types of safety buckets. Operational safety, which basically has to do with whether people wear a helmet or the number of crashes that the scooter driver is in. But also device safety. As a transportation agency, we focus mostly on the former because we manage transportation in public right-of-way. We're not consumer product safety regulators, and we believe that there could be a role that the federal government can play in safety of these, and paying some attention to the safety of these devices. In the terms and conditions of our scooter permits, also in the new regulations that we published for scooters, we made a requirement that riders should wear a helmet and scooter companies must provide crash data to the district on quarterly basis. But scooters are just the beginning in the world of mobility. Federal government taking the lead in the safety area will lead to less confusion and let local regulators focus on applications of these devices rather than being concerned that if these devices are safe to be operated in public right-of-way and on sidewalks.
Remember, this is free for all. I'm going to the floor because I have an amendment coming up on the floor. Ranking members here, any member can speak up and ask a question or make a statement. Go ahead, Mr. Hayes. Hayes, you said you wanted to speak.
Before you walk out, applaud the district and the work that they've done in cycling infrastructure. That's a shared priority with a lot of the scooter companies to have safe, dedicated infrastructure for these devices.
Speak into that.
Now consider, though, that many scooter riders are not familiar with the cycling community. In Portland, they found that 43% of scooter riders were not regular cyclists. And so there is an educational threshold, and that's something that companies have been taking on aggressively. When you sign up, you have to go through this little educational bit on the apps, and it tells you how to safely operate the scooter. There are helmets available. That's something that right away, someone who's not familiar with riding a small device on a city infrastructure is going to require a degree of education. And I think as we see people more familiar with both riding these devices and interacting in a city environment where these devices are operating, that we'll come to a modicum of understanding of how to more safely operate the device.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hayes, and I appreciate the chair for allowing us to, again, hear from you. I learned a lot today. I mean, my district obviously is much different than some other congressional districts. You know, Portland, Oregon, for example, Pinellas County, for example. I have more of a rural district. It's a rural district, but it has a lot of transit issues because I have 4 public universities. So tell me, you know, areas in urban areas that we're talking about right now, like the chair's district, or districts like Portland, that Chairman DeFazio's district. Okay, what a coincidence. What a coincidence here in the T&I committee. And I'm glad it's a free-for-all. These guys are going to regret giving me a free-for-all in this committee. But it seems that ride-sharing opportunities for more MOD devices. Opportunities for better transit schedules exist in the urban areas a lot more than they ever do in the rural areas that I serve, or in the mini urban areas that I serve. So explain to me how you see the technology and especially the interoperability between ride-sharing companies and other MOD devices with your transit systems. How can that translate to rural areas and many urban areas like mine? Mr. McHugh or Mr. Miller?
That's a great question. Obviously,
You can stop there then.
the programs that we've created in Pinellas County, I know have been applied to suburban and more rural communities as well. The idea of, especially in areas that have very limited mass transit options, about providing some sort of efficient way to connect people from, say, suburban neighborhoods or more rural neighborhoods where there may not be a sidewalk that connects them to the main road, or they may not, it may be too far to walk. To get them a Uber or a Lyft ride or some sort of microtransit or low-cost way to get to the transit where it exists actually benefits both the transit agency, which maximizes where it can do best on the main lines, on where it can have the highest ridership, and doesn't necessarily waste a lot of money on empty buses running around in a very low dense environment. Maybe there is another option, some other kind of connection to get from lower density areas, rural areas, to the main transit. We've shown that we can complement using TNCs, we can complement the transit system, get more rides on transit by partnering with the TNCs.
You have more rides on transit? More rides, you said?
Yes, by all of our programs, when we're connecting using Uber and Lyft and getting these people to go from neighborhoods that are off the route to a bus stop where they can catch the bus, or they can take a bus to their job, but then the buses stop running at 10 o'clock at night, so then their shift doesn't end until 1 o'clock in the morning, and so they get a TNC ride home. That increases the transit rides as well as through our partnership.
Interesting. Mr. McHugh, you got any comments?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think that we can put up all the technology in the world. We can make it easily for people to plug their services in. But if nobody provides their data, if nobody participates in it, it's just an empty app that does absolutely nothing. And there really needs to be incentivizing programs in order to both get the services in the areas that we need them. I totally agree. Right-sizing the vehicle that's going to serve the area is the most practical thing we can do. But like I said, we've had difficulty in order getting all of the people to participate and provide the information so that people can see it and use it.
So one last question. I get the fact you've had data sharing problems. What can we do as a committee? What can we do policy-wise to deal with that problem of data sharing so that you might be able to get more transit rides in communities like yours and eventually in communities like ours?
So I mentioned in my opening statement the National Transit Database reporting. These partnerships are not always predicated on, but certainly are supported by the ability to report the data on TNC use to the National Transit Database and be able to get reimbursement as such. As that is currently defined, it is defined based on the dispatch. So hypothetically, let's say a taxi could be dispatched and pick up a second person, right? But if you got in a taxi out there outside of Rayburn and took it over to Union Station and a second person jumped in on the ride, you'd be pretty surprised, right? And so we want to update that definition to focus on the mode, focus on what the service is being used for rather than what the type of service is. So if a specific ride in an Uber or Lyft alone in Pinellas County at 1 in the morning makes the most sense, that should be reimbursable. Maybe in an urban core, that single ride isn't the way to do it. And so it should be a dynamic definition that focuses on the ability to reimburse the solution that makes most sense for the situation.
Thank you all. Mr. Borgen?
We work with systems in your district. I'm familiar with Champaign and Bloomington, and they're very efficient high-performing.
Darn right they are.
Yeah, they are. We've worked with you on the STIC program that rewards them for their efficiency. From the rural communities in your district moving into those areas, again, I'd focus on outcome-based performance. So how are we working with hospitals and other kind of regional trip incubators to get to services that can, for instance, hospitals know what a no-show costs. And transit can reduce those. And transit in the larger sense, not just the fixed route buses, but the services that we're talking about integrated together. And then we've got to talk to healthcare when we reduce those costs to invest in the systems that are creating those outcomes for them. There's employer-based outcomes. A lot of larger rural employers are looking for employees, and they know the cost of turnover. And when we can, again, with better mobility options, using these strategies, reduce turnover, there's an economic viability of that too.
Could I get a question in? Who's in charge here, Rodney? I like this format. I can imagine, I'm Jared Huffman from California. Parts of my district look a lot like what Rodney described, very rural. I also have some areas where we're a lot more metropolitan. And so I can sort of imagine these things working in some places, and I struggle to apply them in others. But the part that really vexes me is I see the potential for some of these mobility on demand strategies to enhance public transit, to make it more accessible, to make it more complete, maybe even more efficient. But I also see the possibility of transit systems that are always strapped for funding getting cannibalized if we start directing some of that funding into these shiny objects. And if we don't integrate them well, and if we don't require basic standards of these platforms, I'm concerned about the race to the bottom scenario that Mr. Reagan described. So I wondered if some of you might speak to this issue of how you might be able to achieve the upside of this integration. And I gotta believe that would require imposing some standards on the Ubers and Lyfts of the world and not just handing them public dollars without risking the downside and the cannibalization of existing public transit.
I want to be definitively clear that these services are not positioned to compete with public transit. They view themselves wholeheartedly as a complement to public transit.
Well, they may view themselves that way, but if we have a fixed amount of public transit money right now.
By all means, and they are not intending to
You don't
compete.
think there's a risk that they would cannibalize public
They are
transit?
not intending to compete for public transit money.
I'm sure they're not intending to.
And so to look at Austin, Texas, for example, where they were banned temporarily, and to look at what people did during their time in Austin when these services weren't available, when Uber and Lyft were not available. 41% went back to using their own vehicle. 42% switched to another ride-sharing app, and 3% went back to public transit. So to look at the ways that people are integrating these services into our life and what they view as an alternative to them.
I'm sorry, I have to point out that in Uber's own IPO, they said that they were going to be competing with transit for these types of service operations. I mean, they've been very clear about that. While I agree that providing more options for people to get to existing transit services are a good thing. I think that's something that we need. We need people to be able to use the services that we're all providing. I think subsidizing, private companies that have been very vague about their own data. They have, a business model that was subsidized by private investors to the tune of $20 billion, and they've continued to lose $14 billion over the last 4 years as an operating. Uber alone lost $14 billion over the last 4 years. So, whether the subsidy is coming from the private investment side or whether it's going to be, we don't think that should be coming from the public dollar side, the public transit money. That should be supporting good paying jobs. That should be part of a community effort to support both the economies of these communities they're serving, as well as the mobility standards for the people that are going to be using those services. And I don't think that we should get just, I think that the technology is exciting. The risk of supplanting what has been a bedrock of our urban and suburban and other communities is pretty high, and something that I think we have to think deeply about.
I'd like to ask a question as well over here.
Can I add one thing to that just before we move on? The one thing I would add is with transit anyway, the measure is always ridership. And while that's an important measure, I think it's not the only measure, and we probably should be doing a lot to develop the congestion, carbon footprint. There are a lot of other things that we should be paying attention to so that we optimize the service and get the right tool for the job.
Thank you. Are there any programs in place that focus on MOD in rural areas?
I mentioned the Vermont MOD sandbox grant through FTA. That absolutely focuses on rural areas. It incorporates all of the rural demand response service in and around the state of Vermont into a seamless trip planning tool so that you can be in the rural parts of the state and access other rural parts of the state through an integrated kind of on-demand app. That's one that certainly is out there. And we're working on some models to integrate volunteer-based driver services into services that will work. The ridership in rural areas is largely older adults and is largely healthcare based. And
Correct. We are very geographically challenged in West Virginia, and we are a continuum of little tiny towns and up a holler and that kind of thing. So it's rather awkward for us to have this happen. I'll change the subject a bit and ask what is happening with ride-sharing companies to make sure that the passengers are protected from predators using their the companies to target individuals like college students?
Certainly, our companies that we work with do background check their drivers to ensure that they are a safe individual. And then on the user side, they have taken extra measures to make sure that someone isn't inadvertently getting into a vehicle of someone who is posing as a rideshare driver. So when you open up the app now, very prominently, whatever service you're using, you see the license plate number of the vehicle that you're intending to get into, and the name of the driver and a picture of the driver. And so with those three pieces of information, as you approach the vehicle, you can cross-reference the license plate. As you enter the vehicle, then you can visually check with the driver, and you can also verbally check with the driver to ensure that it is the person that you were intending to get into the vehicle with.
Anyone else want to chime in on that one?
I'll just add in our programs, we always give, it's the customer's choice what they want to choose. They can often choose our own employee providing them the trip, a taxi, or an Uber. All of our programs, whether it's for people with disabilities, whether it's for low-income people late at night, or just anyone in a first mile, last mile, more and more, as they start learning how to use the TNCs, they are choosing they're choosing that option more and more over the taxis or over other modes as they learn it more. So it's a customer choice. I think some of the features of the apps are getting more enhanced so that you do feel safer when you use them. It's certainly not perfect, but it seems to be what the customers are choosing.
Congresswoman, I noted in my oral testimony that there is not a federal standard for background checks for any of these rideshare services. If Congress is asking about what role they can play to try to improve this, I think background checks is one thing that people can look at to make sure that there's a standard across the board. I know that there's a difference between many of the different agencies that would be, or localities that would regulate Uber and Lyft and other type of systems to try to make sure that they have their own system, but they don't all go through the FBI system. They don't all go through whatever specific background check medium they would need.
Thank you. I'll take it home. I will end. We're all very aware of what happened in Columbia, South Carolina, and the horror for that young girl as well as her parents and all her friends. So I do think it's very important that background checks happen and that we develop some way to make sure that people are connecting with the right vehicle when they leave.
Congresswoman, I'd add that some of the TNCs are starting to move into the non-emergency medical transportation provision business as well. And we have great concerns there also about the training. You're transporting someone going to dialysis, and there's certain skill sets that those drivers really need to have that a casual driver, typical Uber or Lyft driver, simply don't have. That, and we have a lot of concerns about a lot of states and their Medicaid offices looking to go to TNCs to provide those trips, but not having the kind of training that's necessary.
I wanted to add that I think it's really important that we look at the conditions of operation, that we get much more aggressive about what the conditions of operation are within the city. I think every single one of us wants the same thing, and there's plenty of playing ground for everybody to have. There's really not a competition going on. What competition is against the single occupant vehicle. If we step up the regulations on how the data that has to be provided, whether or not you have to provide open access to it, what the conditions are for background checks or whatever it is, I think being much more aggressive about that so that we're focusing on what we're trying to accomplish within the city as opposed to just flooding it with lots of options.
If I may, regarding data sharing that you just mentioned, we as a transportation agency need data for planning and regulatory compliance purposes, but we understand that there's there are privacy concerns around these topics. And therefore, through the Open Mobility Foundation, which was launched this morning, and DDOT is a founding member of, we have been on the table with a cohort of cities and organizations such as NACTO, the National Associations of City Transportation Officials, to discuss how we can use data management platforms to interact with mobility on-demand services.
Sharing data is an important part of this, and it's something that our companies work with each individual city to make sure that they have the data that they need to, one, be assured that they're getting their fair end of the deal, but also that that is available for city planning, right? Whether it is a scooter or an e-bike or an Uber or Lyft, they operate best in an environment that is well planned to accommodate the future of transportation. It's why anonymized data, aggregated data has been released publicly by a lot of these companies, not just within data sharing agreements. Of course, we do want to preserve the ability to make sure that personally identifiable information isn't put at risk, whether for hacking or for a use that the company or the rider who initially agreed to share that data might not approve. As a rider of an Uber or Lyft, you acknowledge that your data will be used, and they need to be able to continue that assurance to the rider that their data will be protected and used only in the way that they gave permission for that to be used.
With respect to aggregated data, we have received actually aggregated data from Uber and Lyft, and that's how we were able to expand our pickup drop-off zones throughout the district. However, for some other planning purposes, we need more detailed data, but we also acknowledge that any mobility data should be treated as PII, personally identifiable information. And so therefore, if the cities have the ability to get the data, detailed data, they can regulate that and make mobility data PII so that in terms of FOIA requests or if they were to be a data breach, people's information don't get used by other entities or bodies.
Certainly, we really appreciate that.
And I'd add to that, the flip side of getting the data is the responsibility of having the data. When we're a governmental agency, we're subject to FOIA requests, and that is a big concern about, yes, we want it, and we want to optimize the service, we want to do all the good things with it, but then somebody can just get it and have a domestic dispute issue, somebody stalking somebody. I think it's within the state of Oregon, we have a bill that went through with regards to our electronic fare system, so that any of the tapping around the system, all the data from that is exempt from FOIA requests. I'd like to see travel pattern data in any form to be exempt from FOIA requests.
The district agrees to that as well.
Appreciate that again.
Well, I'll take a swing at this too. I'm Doug Lamalfa from North California, inland from Mr. Huffman there. We have our two large cities, and this makes people from other areas laugh, are just under about 100,000 each, and then the rest of our cities are, I'll call them mid-size, or I can't think of one that's over 20,000. That might be generous. So you have a lot of medium-sized cities around, 8 to 12,000, and most everything's at least 20 miles or so from the next one or more. And then you have a lot of really small towns in the range of 3,000 down to 500. So, and the two larger cities are about 70 miles apart. It's an 11-county district. California has 58 counties, so by land mass it might be, 1/6 of the size of the state. So you see what we got going. For example, I-5 runs right up the heart of it from where it starts the Oregon border and ends at the southern part of my district, starts the next one. But right next to it is the Sacramento River. And for example, a town named Dunsmuir is runs right, surrounds I-5. It's around 1,600 people. So again, you compare that to San Jose, Silicon Valley, LA, whatever, got a lot of different needs. And plus rural folks kind of have different ideals about what they want to do and who's telling them what they have to do. They react less well to being told what to do than perhaps other areas. So, and so the eternal battle is, the amount of ridership for public transportation in the counties that might be a little larger. There's frequent bus routes, and that's all good, but ridership is pretty light most of the time. There might be peak times of the day when, going between one town and the county seat, it does okay. So I guess it's good to have a discussion about how do we have it more tailored, more instant need, where if you have this personal transportation where instead of running an entire bus that has 5 or 6 on it, maybe there is an Uber van or a small van or what have you that is more pinpointed to the actual time instead of running a route. I'm just looking at everything that's on the table that would make the most sense. I'm not anti or pro on either one per se. So in a rural population, like what Ms. Miller was talking about, almost everybody has a car, some type of vehicle like that. And if they don't, their neighbor, their relatives is probably taking care of them if they are needing transportation to a medical need, or they are getting that occasional, some form of cab ride. So, and it's tough for these rural towns to install, bus routes and have a whole lot of public transportation. They might have a very limited amount that makes sense on a peak time during peak days. So this kind of ends up being maybe elderly folks with disabilities, and a lot of that might actually be veterans as well. And they have a long ways to go to get to veterans facilities. So this all said, I'd throw it back to the panel here. Start with Mr. Bogren. What are some of the ways we can achieve a on-demand mobility and in the much more rural areas like this, where you're not going to get the economy of scale? And is there a model for private companies to do that, or is there a reverse model of a public-owned one that can operate on a little more mobility on demand, a little more Uber style, call it when you need it type thing, and they can have that mobility, and the price per trip may not be the cheapest, but it's more tailored towards when it's needed, which might be more efficient in that sense. What do you think?
There are options, and in communities like yours, we work directly with them. Those are our members. And oftentimes, there are federally funded transit providers that are doing specialized services, so they're targeting certain populations, seniors, people with disabilities. They're typically not doing that on fixed routes. They're doing that in the traditional demand response mode that we are trying to move into on demand. So again, I spoke earlier about those 24 and 48-hour advance notice windows that have traditionally been a part of those services. The concepts that the TNCs and the urban areas are bringing together can be applied in rural America. You're spot on that the approach has to make sense in the community. And so one big piece of this is really understanding population demographics and demands and needs. And it also has to take into account volunteerism in rural communities, which is different. It has to take into account those distances that you're talking about. And so mileage-based concepts have to be brought into it, because you may have a veteran that needs to go 2 or 3 hours one way to a VA center or a CBOC.
Unless we can better implement veterans' choice and you can go to a local one. Different committee, different topic.
That would solve a lot of problems on the transportation side. So those options are out there, and I think this next round of federal investment in surface transportation has to incent rural and smaller communities to adapt these kinds of ideas. And these sandbox grants that have been applied in rural communities are great tools to learn, and we're then engaged in taking what's learned and broadcasting that out across the country so that everybody can benefit from those.
Anybody else on the panel want to touch that? Yes, sir.
Congressman, in the northern part of our community in Florida,
Choke up on it, that's the main thing. There you go.
in the northern part of our community in Pinellas County, Florida, we have a smaller town, Tarpon Springs, Florida, where we launched something I think could be adapted in many, many smaller communities. The hospital in Tarpon Springs did an analysis that showed that no-shows by folks missing doctor's appointments was costing them a lot of money, and they gave us $20,000 to pilot an idea using our partnership with TNCs that we had adopted for the rest of the county. They are paying for senior citizens to get to and from medical appointments using Lyft or taxis or wheelchair-accessible vans that we have. And that partnership was struck in that small community. And I think, and I know that's a problem in all over the place, where folks can't get to doctor's appointments or they can't get to the pharmacist to get their drugs. For us to provide a shuttle, any kind of fixed route bus system up there wouldn't make any sense, because those appointments happen all the different times of the day. So can we provide a more efficient, real-time kind of solution? We can. And that program is working very successfully, and I think that could be adopted in lots of smaller towns.
Well, certainly, when the hospital can show that it's losing pretty serious money by missed appointments, that makes a lot of sense for them to step forward and see how that would work, at least over time. And so that's good. We're talking about and delivering people to places. Now, and sometimes, how about like the pharmacy? Maybe there's cases where the pharmacy can go to the people. How much can we see as far as delivery of pharmaceuticals or, household items, groceries, whatever? What would you see as being part of this solution for unnecessary traffic on a delivery of product scale in very rural areas like this? We make that more affordable. Is that something that anybody on the panel's been thinking about? Oh boy, it's a gang. It's a gang.
They are.
Yeah, look who we brought, Portland, Oregon.
Yep. I'm glad you brought that back. I was hoping I could ride with Mr. Davis on that back to Illinois with them, conjuring up Jeff Daniels and Jim Carrey. Anyway, any more thoughts on, is there much thought we should be giving towards delivering things to the people with some of this? I know we have delivery services and stuff, but applying that to a more extreme rural, is there something that we could be thinking about there too?
As you mentioned, a lot of those delivery services are in place and typically at this point have been piloted and pioneered in more urban environments. Our companies would certainly be open to discussions with you all to see how that could be applied to a more rural environment. But being a new service, they have launched most of them, at least initially, in more urban environments.
Yeah, would there be a federal funding stream that anybody can identify on helping on either of these topics?
The two federal funding streams that exist, that we'd like to have exist today, one is what we talked about before, allowing these connecting rides, regardless of mode, that connect and complement the public transit that exists in a community to count toward the federal formulas for the existing funding. Second is the innovation funding, the Mobility on Demand Sandbox program that the Federal Transit Administration has implemented that we've spoken about a lot on this panel, where that's the funding that we access to try these innovative ideas without really the risk. If they fail, we can modify them or we're not going to be penalized in any way.
Right.
That program we certainly would advocate that Congress should continue to support.
So not unlike what the gentleman from Portland was talking about, a mixed mode where it might make sense to do an Uber or Lyft for a distance and then get to an existing structure, a transit, and have a short trip that people will actually use, that type of thinking?
Yeah, I would say one of the barriers to implementing the demand responsive service that we were talking about in a rural area is you don't have the technology, basically, in order to schedule that. You have to go out and get that in order to say, how do I have a person call in and know when that there's 10 people in this area, and how do you optimize a route, and how do you put that together? That costs money. Even for a very small transit agency, that's significant. So some of these tools that are coming out are really, it's important to recognize that it's an open source tool that anybody can do for very low cost to implement that. And in funding those kind of activities, I think can start to open up an Uber to come in and operate in that area, because now there's something that will get drivers some business.
Makes sense. All right, I'll yield back to Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen. Sorry that I wasn't here for the beginning. I was over in the Speaker's office with the Chairman of Ways and Means, and we're making one more run on the White House on funding transportation infrastructure, so we'll see how that goes. I was just in Berlin with the committee, and they were about to launch an app there where wherever you're located in the city or suburbs, you input your location and your destination, and it'll give you every conceivable option to get there, whether you start with a scooter, an electric bike, you walk, there's local conveyances, and then, take you to a traditional transit, the whole, everything. And that's, I assume we're looking at doing similar things here, which would be really helpful to people to just let them know what their options are. But I want to ask one other question, and, this is, I believe as we rebuild and build out the future infrastructure, we've got to deal with defossilization, and, therefore, should we be providing some sort of federal incentive or subsidy or, tax, and maybe just something on the tax side to incentivize modes that can help mitigate congestion and help contribute to a decrease in fossil fuel pollution? Anybody, and any ideas on what that might be? Nope. Okay.
We as an organization have not taken a position on any specific incentive, but some of our companies have weighed in on that. I know that Uber specifically has talked about congestion pricing as one option. But again, as an organization, we haven't found a blanket solution that would work for the whole industry.
There's an interesting question around congestion, which is the zero occupancy vehicle tax. I was talking to Congressman Blumenauer about this, and he's saying, well, you know, if people are competing to get the vehicle to you to pick you up, they're going to want to put more vehicles out there. They put more vehicles out there to the point where you have a short wait time, then we're actually increasing potentially congestion. So, you know, congestion pricing that might also include a zero occupancy tax.
Yeah.
Certainly, a lot of the companies are looking at shared rides as the future of mobility on demand. So we've seen the Uber Pool and Lyft line products grow exponentially, and those are certainly a place that we would like to see riders incentivized into.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I would argue that investment in robust transit systems with, you know, whether it be through trains or high occupancy buses or passenger rail are a way to really reduce greenhouse emissions. I think those are important systems that are already in place that we need to make sure are accessible for more people. We need to make sure they're running clean vehicles. We need to make sure they're growing and providing better services for their constituents. And I think there's a real solution already in place that we need to have a better federal investment in order to provide real opportunities for people.
Totally agree, and that was a big part of the speaker was asking me, what do you need if we do a bill? And I said, well, just to bring existing transit up to a state of good repair is $100 billion. But doing that would bring back a lot of ridership because it would be more dependable, it would be more pleasant, and people would say, oh yeah, I don't mind taking the bus, or I don't mind taking the light rail now that it, you know, isn't breaking down all the time and I'm having to get out of the station, get on a bus and go downtown. So I agree 100%.
Yeah, in all of our communities, whether it's St. Petersburg, Florida, or New York City, we are seeing at certain times of the day, or maybe often, TNCs create, at least in our community on Fridays and Saturday nights, congestion and gridlock in our urban core. We have to have high-capacity transit investment continue. We're going to need bus rapid transit systems, rail systems in our bigger cities to move the number of people and to not just face gridlock. We do think that these TNCs and other modes can complement transit, get more people to the transit lines, but in our main corridors and in our urban centers, we're always going to need mass transit.
Right. Well, the Bright Line, which Chairman Schuster took the committee down to visit a couple of years ago, they originally were going to run vans to, you know, to bring people to get the ridership to the Bright Line. But by the time they finished the project, they said, well, now we got Uber and Lyft. And so you go on their app, you say where you are, where you want to go, and you pay, the Uber picks you up, drops you at the station, you get on the train, same app. You take the train to Miami, you get off, an Uber or Lyft is there waiting to pick you up and takes you to your destination. Yeah. So that's complementing the mass transit. That's exactly the way this stuff could work.
Yeah, exactly.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, I've been trying to think about some of the things we've been hearing in the context of the great trip that you led us on a couple weeks ago, because Chairman DeFazio took us to some really interesting communities that are doing innovative things on mobility. And the piece that I keep coming back to is the need for planning that happens by the local communities themselves and transportation planners, and not just constant adaptation and reaction to these technologies and business plans that roll out faster than we can even consider the consequences. And it was really interesting to contrast a place like San Francisco, near my home, where, you know, frankly, we've been overrun by ride sharing to the point where I think many people feel like we got to put some standards in place. We got to rein this thing in and get some sideboards, because you can't even get into San Francisco Airport anymore with all the circling Ubers and Lyfts. To a place like Dijon, France, where as part of an integrated plan, this entire city put out a mobility contract that covered everything. And a single pass now lets the citizens of Dijon access bikes and scooters and electric buses and rail and everything they need. And it's all integrated. So I think somewhere in this conversation we need to get back to the need to incentivize good transportation planning and mobility planning, and not just the constant reaction to the interesting things people can make money on. Because we got a lot of scooters laying around on the sidewalk right now, and I'm not sure 5 years from now we're going to think that's a good idea.
So in the district, while DDOT is interested in innovating and bringing new mobility solutions in the district, at the same time, we're also building up and planning for our bus priority program, because we know that the only way to move a greater number of people into dense areas is a transit system or a bus.
Yeah, and I would add that there's a lot more we can do to prioritize transit traffic. I think that putting the mass transit need for the roadway above the others is a big area where there's a lot of potential for growth.
Bring up something quickly personal since you happen to be here. I live on a boat. I live at the wharf. It's a disaster. And if you're going to double the size of it without changing the patterns and the options, you're going to have permanent gridlock down there. I'd love to have you come in sometime and chat about it.
Yeah,
I
certainly.
have some ideas.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
And I concur.
Happy to keep coordinating.
I concur with the chairman. I live down on that area as well, and it's becoming a nightmare. But, Mr. Chairman, if I may, my line of questioning usually falls in the same germane area in terms of low-income riders. And increasingly, interconnectivity for the new modes of transportation seems very promising, but has potential to be game-changing. But it may benefit only people who can afford it. How will mobility on demand be accessible for low-income riders, and what can be done to ensure access for them?
And this is something that I think that, unfortunately, there's been a degree of misconception around who the typical rider of, let's say, anywhere from a scooter to an Uber X is. You know, if you look at Lyft, for example, it is 40-some% of their rides are originating or ending in a low-income area. We've seen exponential adoption by low-income communities of scooters and e-bikes. In DC alone, it was 1/4 of jump bike trips, which are an electric dockless bike, are in the areas that are least served by transportation solutions. So these things might be an extraordinary convenience to a high-income area, but as you mentioned, for a low-income area that typically doesn't have taxi service, may have inferior transit service, they tend to be a lifeline. They're their only affordable transportation option.
But we only see these costs don't tend to go down, they go up. So as the costs for these services go, now that they have a captive audience with the scooters and all, well, now the scooter, can eventually be double, the cost that it was when they were implementing it and getting people attracted to it. So.
And some companies have taken steps to mitigate that. Lyft, for example, has a program that if you are on SNAP, you can actually access a certain amount of free scooter rides. And so they've taken steps to try to make these services more affordable and more accessible to communities.
Okay, well, I just hope that, we can continue to keep that in mind, as this interconnectivity grows and the mobility does as well. Thank you.
By all means.
Congressman, I think there's regulatory needs there as well to address accessibility issues and non-discrimination policies. In most cases, there are, not every state requires those policies in place. If you're talking about local municipalities, that's also not the case. There is a real vague patchwork of regulations that are needed that are required of all transit agencies when you're talking about making sure that there's ADA compliance, you're making sure they have the right vehicles, light training, you're making sure you're reaching certain neighborhoods. That is not guaranteed by the rideshare economy right now, and it's something that, particularly if you're looking at ways that are supplanting existing public transit service, is something that really needs to be addressed. Is the guarantees that are currently in place for transit agencies that are making sure that, for instance, you have people who are properly trained with wheelchair accessible vehicles and things like that to get to these communities and make sure that people receive the service they deserve.
Yeah, I just had a group in to see me today that is concerned about, the automation of cars and, not having to actually physically drive them anymore, that there is an ADA component built into some of the models of these cars. So a car could be for anybody, someone with, handicapped or ADA compliance. issues that these car companies are creating at least one model that would accommodate them regardless of what their situation circumstances. So it's something that we definitely have to watch as we move forward in this space. So, but thank you.
Congressman, that's a great idea too on accessibility. As we move into the automated technologies, let's not repeat having to retrofit systems into accessibility, and let's purpose build it from the start. That's certainly where our association is.
Sure, there have been some companies that have already expressed some interest in doing it, but I mean, you know, for each type of company, I don't want to say any names, but you know, along the gamut, each one should offer an ADA compliant vehicle. And you know, some people like Toyota, some people like Chevy. Each manufacturer should look at having something for that population, since you're not going to need the actual physical driving of the vehicle anymore. So
exactly.
Thank you.
I would just add, it certainly is a challenge, but exactly what you brought up about this new mobility paradigm is raising a lot of questions about access. Scooters, bikes, all of Uber and Lyft are not accessible to many, many people. And so we struggle in the Tampa Bay region of having enough wheelchair accessible vehicles to meet our demand. We can meet the demand for able-bodied folks, no problem, but getting enough wheelchair accessible vehicles so that the time it takes to hail a ride is somewhat comparable to an Uber or Lyft is really something we're constantly trying to figure out how we can do.
And it's something that I'm very sensitive to, because although I'm not have an ADA issue, there have been, you know, times when the people were talking today about waiting for a cab or someone, and the cab is ADA compliant, but they see them there and they just go by them. They don't want to stop and pick them up. And you know, I'm sensitive to that for another reason. So it's something that we have to pay attention to, you know, as we move forward in this. And they said the Uber and Lyft the same way. It's very difficult for, you know, Uber and Lyft to accommodate, you know, ADA, people that have ADA issues.
100% in agreement with you that we have ways to go in terms of getting this right. You know, there have been significant strides for access, particularly in the non-ambulatory impairment space, so people that may have an auditory or visual impairment, because of the technology that's built into these apps, are able to use them just like anybody else. And therefore, that person is not requiring a specialized mode of transit. They can get access much quicker. That does open up wheelchair vehicles that may have otherwise catered to people with non-ambulatory disabilities to be available exclusively for someone that did need a wheelchair accessible vehicle.
And on another point, Mr. Reagan, you know, as you're aware, some transportation workers, such as Uber drivers, incur fees and expenses that can result in far lower take-home pay than other transportation workers. Innovations such as mobility on demand should not be built on the backs of low-income workers, potentially furthering the cycle of poverty. What can be done to ensure that these new jobs are good-paying jobs?
Well, I think, you know, we need to make sure that these companies are held to the same standards that that we hold our transit agencies to. We need to expand their ability to collectively bargain. I think that there is, you know, in many cases, if you're talking about Uber or Lyft or any of these technology, they're classifying themselves as technology companies. They're not transportation companies. They're not providing transportation. They're providing technology. And if we're talking about real transportation solutions for our communities, then they need to be, you know, I think the regulatory policies have to reflect that the entrants into the market need to be following the same types of laws, regulations, labor policies that other transit agencies and real transportation providers are subject to. The moment we start talking about federal subsidies, state subsidies, you know, that public money, these things need to be applied. And I think that's an important part of all of this, is to make sure that they don't, you know, new entrants are subject to the exact same standards and the same non-discrimination policies, you know, accessibility policies, all of the issues that we're talking about right here. Once you start getting public money, that needs to be applied to them. regardless of whether you consider yourself a tech company or not, you're providing a transportation service.
Thank you. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak at this time? I'm just sorry I had to go to the floor to introduce an amendment. But I think, from what I heard before I left, that this subcommittee has accomplished with this roundtable what it intended. I admit, I concede that we have opened up more questions than we have answers for, but you have readied us for preparation for the upcoming bill, the 2020 bill. So I want to thank the members who came. I certainly want to thank all of you who participated for contributions that opened up whole new areas that simply must be taken seriously. Thank you again, and this roundtable is closed.
Thank you.